Good afternoon and welcome. For those of you whom I haven't met, I'm Lloyd Minor, Dean of Medicine at Stanford, and it's a privilege and honor to welcome you to this afternoon's Dean's Lecture. Thank you very much for coming. I hope that today's talks will inspire you and challenge you to help create a more welcoming and inclusive community here at Stanford Medicine. A community that values equally the contributions of all people. But to do this, we must first acknowledge and understand the challenges faced by minorities, including sexual and gender minorities. Today, we will hear from two outstanding speakers about LGBT challenges, with a particular focus on healthcare and its long history of bias and discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. It's my hope that we'll all leave here today with fresh ideas and renewed energy for ensuring that sexual and gender minorities receive the equitable, sensitive health care that is their right. Like all of you, I am very proud of the LGBT members of our community. And I'd like all of us to take a moment now to thank the members of our LGBT community for the extraordinary contributions they make to Stanford and to the world. I'd like to now introduce our first speaker, Dr. Mitchell Lunn. In fact, it's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Lunn back home to Stanford, where he received his MD degree. Mitch is an assistant professor of nephrology at UCSF and a long-standing advocate for sexual and gender minority inclusion in research and in higher education. He's the co-director of the PRIDE study, a national online longitudinal cohort study of sexual and gender minorities, as well as a principal investigator of PRIDEnet, a participant in a research-powered network of sexual and gender minorities designed to engage communities in their research process. A 2010 graduate of the Stanford School of Medicine, Mitch is a founding member of Stanford's Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Medical Education Research Group. Mitch, thank you very much for being here. We look forward to your remarks.
Hey. All right, well, thank you for that wonderful introduction and for inviting me to speak here today. It's really a pleasure to be back in this beautiful building that I wish was open when I was a medical student, but it wasn't. So to start, this is not necessarily a really lucrative field, so I have no related disclosures to this presentation. And today, we're going to talk about a few things that I hope will leave you with a little bit of knowledge and hopefully a little bit more discussion as you go forward about how to care for and our society's treatment of sexual and gender minorities. And to start, I usually talk a little bit about myself. I am a gay cisgendered man. Cisgender, for those that aren't familiar with the term, is academic medicine's and really academia's term to describe somebody who's not transgender. So those of you that have taken organic chemistry remember cis and trans molecules. And I use typical traditional male pronouns like he, him, and his. And I also talk fast, and so be sure to pay attention over the next 20 minutes or so. And to start, I wanted to actually tell you a little bit about the population that we're going to be discussing over the next hour, which is that sexual and gender minorities is now an umbrella term to describe people who are not heterosexual and are not cisgender. And so that typically includes the population that we know of, the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer communities. But people may be familiar with many other acronyms, things like LGBTQIAA turning into this large kind of alphabet soup, and so that gets to be very confusing and puzzlesome. And so this umbrella term of sexual and gender minorities has really been developed to encompass that entire community. And if we look at population estimates of at least the LGB and sometimes T in these studies, population estimates, you can see that we account for anywhere between 4 to 6% of the United States population. which is equal to roughly 20 to 25 million people in this country. And so the important part that I want to kind of drive home today is that sexual and gender minorities are underserved, understudied, and are vulnerable to poor health outcomes. And this is really rooted in history, that homosexuality was a psychiatric diagnosis in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders until 1973, when it was finally removed. And as the ability to clone genes came into favor in the 80s and more so in the 90s, there was a hunt for really the gay gene so that various quote-unquote mutations could either be fixed or repaired. Similarly, during that time, psychiatry and psychology developed conversion or reparative therapy as a way to quote-unquote cure people of their LGBT status. And then in the early 80s, our community was really rocked with the beginnings of the HIV epidemic, and images like this filled the media and filled our homes. And that really prompted the LGBT community to rally and to self-organize, asking the medical community and medicine and the researchers for help. Unfortunately, that was oftentimes met with hysteria, and from the medical community and the government, it was oftentimes neglected. And this was really the beginnings of a cognizant awareness of sexual and gender minority health and healthcare disparities that really continue to persist today. And with that, I'd like to show you just a short 1-minute video.
Lesbians do it almost 3 times as much as straight women. Gay men do it nearly twice as much as straight men. And more than 400,000 people die from it every year. In fact, more people die from it than suicide, alcohol, car accidents, illegal drugs, and HIV combined. So, what is it? Smoking. It's time to speak up. We have to protect each other. To learn more, visit tobaccofreeca.com.
And while I don't necessarily think he stopped smoking at that exact moment, it illustrates a point, which is that smoking is the LGBT community's largest health burden. We smoke about 2/3 more than the general population, spending about $8 billion a year and cutting significant years off of our life expectancy. Aside from this, there are numerous other health disparities, including the fact that transgender people have attempted suicide. 41% of the transgender people have attempted suicide, compared to 1.6% of the general population. And of our homeless youth in this country, 40% of them identify as LGBT or T. We would be remiss, of course, to not talk about HIV, with 64% of new infections happening among men who have sex with men, despite only representing anywhere from 2 to 4% of the population. And those disparities are even more pronounced amongst transgender people, and even more pronounced amongst transgender people of color. And the discrimination is really persistent and pervasive. And this is just an example of protections against discrimination for employment. So all the dark green states here have protections against being fired from your job because you're LGBT or T. The lighter green states, Wisconsin and New Hampshire, have protections just against sexual orientation, but not against discrimination based on gender identity. And all the light-colored states, of which there are 28 of them, I could be fired for being gay on any given day that I would walk into my job there. 2 states, Arkansas and Tennessee, have the yellow triangle, which actually have laws preventing the passage of non-discrimination laws. And so this is really just an example of how pervasive discrimination and stigma is in a variety of different arenas, even outside of healthcare. But that effect really ripples into both medical research and into the federal government. The LGBT status of people, that is their sexual orientation and gender identity, is not collected in the United States Census. So we have no information about the distribution of LGBT people's age, their geographies, their race and ethnicities, their religions. The LGBT status has not been systematically collected in longitudinal health studies like the Framingham Heart Study or the Nurses' Health Study. And we've been really excluded from cross-sectional federally funded studies like NHANES or the National Health Interview Survey. And I put an asterisk here next to NHIS because for the first time in 2013, sexual orientation at least was collected in that data set. And that really spun out from a report that the Institute of Medicine released in 2011. And this was a report on the health of LGBT people at the request of the National Institutes of Health because they were starting to get so many grant applications on this population that they actually didn't know what to fund. And they started to need a research agenda. And this quote is one that we quote frequently and find it to be very powerful, which is that the relative lack of population-based data presents the greatest challenge to describing the health status and health-related needs of LGBT people. And that really illustrates this cycle, which is that we don't know a lot, we know some, but not a lot about health disparities that affect the sexual and gender minority community. We don't understand their etiologies. And health workers, the federal government, other research studies don't ask about sexual orientation or gender identity, which presents a lack of data related to this population. And the cycle really continues to persist with health disparities continuing. And so we, my close colleague and friend Juno Obden-Maliver, who also graduated from Stanford in 2010, have developed the PRIDE study, which stands for Population Research in Identity and Disparities for Equality. Like any good study, you need an acronym. And it is a longitudinal prospective cohort study that is designed for LGBTQ people and by them. It's an engaged community of LGBT people helping to design the study and really engaging them from beginning to end. We launched at the end of June 2015, just before the same-sex marriage decision from the Supreme Court, and have enrolled now over 17,000 participants. And you can read more about that at pridestudy.org or talk with me after. But I really want to spend the majority of today talking about sexual and gender minority experiences in medicine and in academic medicine. And to start, let's start with the patients. This is a study of about 5,000 people with, that are LGBT or that live with HIV. And you can see that 10 to 20% of them state that healthcare professionals have either refused to touch them, have blamed them for their health status, or have used harsh or abusive language when receiving medical care. And between 4 and 8% of people have actually been physically abused or roughed by their healthcare professionals. And for those of us that are educators, this, I think, drives the point home, which is that 49% of LG and B people and nearly 90% of transgender people state that there are not enough healthcare professionals adequately trained to care for them. And when we look at medical students, unfortunately, we see similar experiences for sexual and gender minority medical students. This was a pilot study done by the AAMC in 2013 of second-year medical students, of which 6% of the sample identified as LG or B. Gender identity was not actually asked on this study. But lesbian, gay, and bisexual students had more stress, more financial concerns, and less social support. And this is data hot off the press from the students that graduated in 2015, nearly 14,000 respondents that have graduated from medical school, and 2.1% of the respondents reported offensive remarks related to sexual orientation. If 6% of our medical students identify as LGB and 2.1% of medical students are experiencing remarks related to their sexual orientation, that means that 35% of LGB medical students today are subjected to offensive remarks during medical school. And this has led many commentators, many physicians, many LGBT researchers, and the lay press to actually ask, is medicine anti-sexual and gender minorities? Do we actually discourage gay doctors? And this is work that the LGBT Medical Education Research Group here at Stanford has done, in which we surveyed nearly 10,000 students, of which nearly 6,000 of them provided sexual orientation and gender identity information, and almost 1,000 of them identified as sexual or gender minorities. And a third of these LG and B students were not out about their sexual orientation in medical school, and 2/3 of the transgender students were not out about their gender identity in medical school. And we wondered why this was. For some people, they felt like it wasn't anybody else's business. I don't consider it part of my professional identity. Some people were afraid of discrimination, that I stand jeopardizing potentially useful professional relationships. Others felt that there was a lack of a supportive LGBT environment, that there's a subtle devaluation of LGBT individuals, even amongst older physicians. But there is some support, but it's hard to tell who you can trust. And that medical school is incredibly intense. I feel that there could not be any worse of a time to come out or question my sexuality. And of course, there were concerns over people's future careers, that I fear that my sexuality, in addition to my gender, would drive patients and colleagues away, and that I'm going into a surgical specialty which is male-dominated and very macho or anti-gay. And so I think that lends the question, what are we actually doing about this? What are we teaching in medical school about sexual orientation and gender identity? And that dates back to 1992. This was a survey of psychiatry education directors that at that point said that there were a mean 3 hours and 3.5 hours, quote, devoted to the topic of homosexuality. And I think looking at these studies, you can see the evolution, because from 1992 to 1998, we move out of psychiatry and into family medicine. And in that time, unfortunately, we see in this study only 2.5 hours devoted to this topic, and more than half actually had no time whatsoever. And so this really led us at the LGBT Medical Education Research Group here at Stanford to do our own study, and that was of deans of medical education at all medical schools in the United States and Canada. And this is really a complex slide really to say that we had a 75% complete response rate and over 85% if you include partial responses. And I would really just direct your attention to the graphs here on the far right-hand side of this slide, which is that the median number of hours in medical school taught on LGBT-related topics is 5 hours. To put that into perspective, there are about 1,650 hours during the first 2 years of medical school. And hours are interesting and great, but I think the larger issue is what actually is being taught. And so this is 16 different topics that are related to LGBT health. And the frequencies that they were taught in the required curriculum are shown here. And I'd really like to just focus on the 6 least taught topics. And these are things that relate to primary care, things like unhealthy relationships and intimate partner violence, substance abuse, and the risk of chronic diseases as they relate to the LGBT population. And even further down on that list are things like gender-affirming surgery and transitioning, things related to the care of transgender individuals that are really largely lacking at medical schools across this country. To really drive the point home, this middle graph here shows that during the clinical years, the last 2 years of medical school, when medical students are interacting with patients face-to-face in the clinic, more than 1/3 of schools have 0 content whatsoever when medical students are really developing their clinical skills. And we asked deans of medical education to rate their opinion globally on a whole of the content at their institution, and nearly 70% rated it as fair, poor, or very poor. I imagine that Dean Prober would not rate the quality of our cardiovascular education as fair. And so I think that there's really a variety of work to be done here. And in part because of this work and others, the AAMC has announced this really seminal resource, not just for medical schools or medical students, but really an entire institutional package. It fits graduate programs, it fits the staff and faculty and students and trainees and really all components of a medical center to really look at changing the institutional climate in providing care for this particular population. It also provided some competencies and some curriculum recommendations that some schools, like the University of Louisville, are piloting now. And medical students are continuing really to drive the field forward. This is a group out of Ohio that's actually publishing a guide, an educational curriculum for use in medical schools. And that should be coming out sometime this year. And so we want to talk, just closing with wrapping up, about how we can actually improve our education, the learning environments, and the patient care that our patients receive. And I've talked a little bit about the experience of patients who are LGBT, a little bit about the students who are LGBT, and providers also have similar data of being subject to discrimination in their academic medical centers or in private practice. And this really can be kind of boiled down to a negative culture in medicine towards sexual and gender minorities. And in this paper that we wrote with Matt Manch, who just graduated from Stanford School of Medicine in 2015, and Gabe Garcia, we provided a few suggestions. And some of them were to modernize the physician workforce and the research on it. Of course, providing policies and programs that ensure a safe and supportive training environment for students, but also for patients, and to recruit a diverse and competent physician workforce. And that actually includes asking sexual orientation and gender identity on the admissions and residency and fellowship applications. Doing so will make sexual and gender minorities visible, safe, welcomed, and supported. And I don't know if anybody knows what this is, but this is actually my double AMC ID number. And for those of you that aren't physicians or aren't medical students, the double AMC ID number is basically a serial number. It's assigned to you before you take the MCAT and follows you for the rest of your life. And so this is really where we can start counting sexual and gender minorities in medicine. There's the pre-MCAT questionnaire, the matriculating student questionnaire, the second-year questionnaire for medical students, and the graduation questionnaire. There are 4 questionnaires in the first 4 years of medical school that we can start asking about medical students' sexual orientation, gender identity, and their experiences. Lots of us go off to residencies and fellowships and graduate medical education, but eventually come back, some of us, into academic medicine, providing yet another place to start doing some research on us and start counting us. Of course, medical centers need comprehensive and inclusive policies and programs, including non-discrimination, visitation, and of course benefits for your same-sex partner employees, students, staff, trainees, and everyone. And I think the other important thing is that LGBT people want to see that they're welcome and respected at a particular medical institution. And that involves various visibility programs. Well, the one I highlight here is a rainbow sticker that shows up on people's ID badges. This is mine from residency and mine from fellowship. And you can see that people, even like the president of the entire hospital, wear them. And you can imagine how great this feels to be walking down the hallways of Brigham and Women's Hospital and seeing thousands of people every day wearing this on their badge as a welcoming and supporting gesture. And there are other institutions like Penn and Vanderbilt that have programs for LGBT health specifically that encompass the students, staff, faculty, patients, and researchers. Other institutions have recognized the leadership and advances that occur in this field. This is at the chancellor level at UCSF, so the highest level. And other places like Stanford have been very progressive in this. This is December of 2010, 2.5 years before the same-sex marriage decision, the Faculty Senate passed a resolution in support of marriage equality. And of course, there's an institutional commitment to sexual and gender minority research here with support for the LGBT Medical Education Research Group. And so to wrap up, I'd like to leave a few takeaways for you, which is that sexual and gender minorities are underserved, understudied, and vulnerable. They are subject to discrimination and mistreatment, that there are a variety of educational and climate initiatives to help improve those experiences in academic medicine and elsewhere. And in order to do that, we need to start researching LGBT people in academic medicine and recruiting physicians in order to provide that culturally competent and humble care as we gradually change our institutional cultures. I'd like to thank everybody here for coming, and thanks to the Stanford LGBT Medical Education Research Group for all their support, my folks at UCSF, and special thanks to Gabe Garcia, Matt Manch, and Juno Obeden-Maliver. Thank you so much.
Well, Mitch, thank you very much, and we'll have time for questions after we hear from Dr. Bowers. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Marci Bowers. Dr. Bowers is a pelvic and gynecologic surgeon who is widely recognized as a pioneer in the field of gender reassignment surgery. She's the first transgender woman to perform transgender surgery. In 2007, Marci became an international authority on clitoral reconstruction for women who have suffered female genital mutilation, and is one of the few surgeons worldwide performing functional genital mutilation reversal. She's also a regional expert in aesthetic vulvar surgery. Marci, it's an honor to welcome you to Stanford Medicine today. We look forward to your remarks.
It's so great to see young faces here, and I have to say I'm really honored to be here. I appreciate Mitchell's comments just before me, and I must say, as this comes live, it normally takes me about 20 minutes to warm up to even address a crowd like this. But in this case, I will be concluding my remarks in 20 minutes. So we have a lot to go through, needless to say. Is this how I advance here then?
Yeah, as soon as it's done
Okay.
acting out.
Great. Uh-oh. I'll just start by saying I have been performing gender reassignment surgery, as was heard, for about the last 13 years. And occasionally I'm asked to come to speak to medical schools, though as pointed out by Mitchell, very, very infrequently. But I will tell you, with perhaps some bit of shock, that the first two medical schools you may be curious to have me speak were in order: the University of Utah and the University of Kentucky. So two fairly improbable places. Let's see, so where are we going to start here? So again, so we'll quickly talk about transgender history. This really is nothing new. Transgender is something that's really been a part of the human fabric, perhaps as from the beginning of time, and it's only now that we're finally unpeeling this last layer of the onion, so to speak. Transgender surgery is certainly a changing landscape. Many more surgeons coming online, and many more in training. We'll talk a little bit about my technique, and lastly about outcomes. So whether you were prepared for it or not, you will be expanding your knowledge of medical pornography here, and so that may give you a time to exit if you're not prepared. We won't be doing the video today. There's just plenty of time without that. So why discuss transgender? Well, transgender persons are increasingly visible. We've had an incredible year. Laverne Cox, our Olympic athlete, Kate Jenner coming out. But they're transgender persons have probably been here throughout history. In fact, the Bible has more than 58 references to eunuchs, which were castrated males, which many believe were actually early transgender persons who willingly allowed themselves to be castrated, which caused the body to feminize, and therefore they allowed to mingle amongst the women of their time, being no longer a sexual threat. But transgender also parallels other civil rights struggles, including that of women's rights, religion. Of course, racial equality is still a struggle. Importantly, though, as pointed out as well, there's a tremendous need to address this in our teenagers. We know they're at risk for bullying and for suicide. As high as 41% of transgender teens are at one point attempt suicide. So it's something we really need to wake up to. We can't be losing these people in the future. But more importantly, my daughters are 25 and 21. They're University of Colorado graduates. My son is at Sonoma State. But it's this generation, your generation, really that for the first time in history is really demanding an unprecedented level of honesty about issues like sexuality, gender identity, no longer burdened by the guilt and the shame and being driven into the closet literally by trying to control things through kind of a moral order. So in terms of my background, I actually graduated from the University of Wisconsin. My medical degree was at the University of Minnesota. Did my residency at the University of Washington. I was department chairperson at Swedish Medical Center in Seattle, if you know it, and I practiced at the Polyclinic there for about 13 years. Most recently, I've been at Mills Peninsula Medical Center in Burlingame, California, where I continue to perform the majority of my surgeries, including one this morning. And I've recently joined the faculty at Mount Sinai Medical Center, where we're going to be we're an unprecedented step in U.S. history, and that is the development of a surgical fellowship in transgender medicine. I was hoping to do that at UCSF. It never quite happened, but Mount Sinai has bravely taken the lead on that, and that begins in March. I've been in practice 25 years plus. The things I'd note, we are almost at 1,500 male-to-female primary genital surgery operations, and almost and heading towards 400 of the female-to-male. So in reference to history, I mentioned the biblical eunuchs, but there was actually an installed pope who was probably not a transgender person, but was an intersex person. A biological female, biological in the sense of having Y chromosomes and a uterus and such, but probably virilized through an intersex condition whereby he was so convincing, not only as a man, but also a leader, that he was installed as Pope. And there was an A&E documentary talking about Pope John, and if you ever get a chance to see it, I'd drop in. But you can imagine a few years into his papacy, when the populace discovered that the truth about their beloved Papa, that somehow he lacked the papal prerequisites for the position. And so they found themselves in a bit of a pickle, you might say. So true to the Vatican, of course, they came up with a solution, which was to put a little portal, or if you will, or a hole in the throne, so that before the plume of smoke is blown installing the new pope, that someone comes around behind the curtain and they check for it to make sure all the papal plumbing is in place. So, and that is a true story. In fact, the Pope Joan's name is actually etched out of the walls of the Vatican. If you look at it, all the popes are listed, and so that name is chiseled out. Modern history of transgender medicine that really began also somewhat ironically in Berlin, where in the time of Hitler, actually, Germany was quite an LGBT-friendly place. In fact, much of the art and science, literature, transgender persons, GLBT persons, were flourishing prior to Hitler coming to power. In fact, when he did so, one of the first things he did was destroy the laboratory of Magnus Hirschfeld, who was the early initiator of much of the early transgender work, and was experimenting with hormones and describing some of this phenomenon in the populace there. Christine Jorgensen is a name many know from her surgical experience in 1952. And then Dr. Baru is the person who discovered the prototype vaginal surgery, which now turns male anatomy into female. Gynecologist. Dr. Bowers was PRIDEnet, small town Trinidad, Colorado. At one point dubbed the sex change capital of the world, and I joined in 2003 there in Colorado, where I practiced for about 8 years. So my history begins there in this line of medicine at about 6,300 vertical feet. This was actually the view from my backyard while I lived there. I moved here to the Bay Area about 6 years ago. Trinidad was a fantastic place. Dr. Bowers came within a couple of pounds of qualifying for the 1954 Olympics or something. So he's showing off here. He passed away in 2006, and that was the seeds that kind of started to lead to my deciding to leave the community there. I'm also got a couple of strong influences, Dr. Pierre Broussard, who practices in Montreal, and Ako Takamatsu, who is a plastic surgeon in Tokyo, Japan. So in 2003, when I began, there really were very, very few surgeons, and this is part of the reason I stepped up from my OBGYN practice. But at the time, a person could be fired which they still can in many states. Difficult to transition on the job. They were usually sent like a witness relocation program, sent to another corner of the earth and told to restart their life there. And that was part of the standards of what people had to do in order to change their sex. Of course, bullying, harassment, family support, though, was quite lacking. And so anyway, we set out shortly after I arrived with a number of media appearances, many of which you may have seen. I was even on an episode of CSI, if you didn't see that episode. It's number 100 if you want to go back, because I do get a small little residual for every time you watch it. I was on CBS Sunday Morning, Oprah, etc. And these kind of appearances were actually very helpful, and along with the subsequent landmark 2009 study that was quoted earlier, that showed that a significant number of transgender adolescents were bullied, about 40% of those at one point attempting suicide. So this really woke up Washington and the insurance industry. In fact, the AMA resolved in 2009 that there begin to get more public support for transgender surgery and recognition of gender identity disorder, which is what it was called at the time. And insurance coverage really began to follow. Now, most countries around the world actually do have coverage in their national health plans for transgender surgery. But so we were in a way quite lagging. In fact, in 2004, only one company out of the Fortune 500 covered transgender surgery. Now, the number in 2012, I believe, was well more than half, and including California being one of the states that mandates transgender surgery coverage. The mainstay of transition-related care for individuals is hormone therapy. For males, in other words, females becoming males, transgender males, the mainstay is testosterone. And of course, for females, it's estrogens and usually some sort of hormone blocker in addition. Hormones are very safe. They needn't be feared. We can look into that, but we don't really have the time to go into the safety of hormone therapy, but it's very safe. In addition, though, patients are required to follow what are called the WPATH standards of care. WPATH is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, of which I am a member, and we meet every 2 years to discuss research, contemporary thinking, activism, legal aspects, etc. And this year's meeting will be in June in Amsterdam. And anyway, we set standards by which a person can change. So this isn't something that can be done like a tattoo. You don't just go out one day and say you're going to be a transgender, you're going to change your sex. And so in fact, though, when you talk to people, you realize that most of them have felt this way or felt at least oddly gendered, not really comfortable in their own skin from a very, 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 very early age. So it isn't something that's impulsive. It's not like a tattoo. It is something that's been there a long time. And this is reassuring because very, very few of these individuals ever regret their decision and seek to surgically reverse course. But in assuring that they do make a reasoned decision, these standards of care are in place, so a person does this in an orderly process. So they require psychological evaluation, again, not because it's a psychological condition, but because they need support. They need a year of cross-sex hormone therapy. They need to live in their desired gender role. They need to be the person they feel themselves to be. And generally, they need to be 18 years of age, although there are rules for exceptions of that, and actually there's some precedent about it being even younger than 18 as being the appropriate time for surgery. Of the surgeries I do, we do something called a tracheal shave, which is an Adam's apple reduction. This can be a telltale giveaway for persons that would give them away as to their underlying genetics. It's always hard to define sex these days because there's biological sex, there's chromosomal sex, there's hormonal sex. So defining that definitively is a whole nother subject that the International Olympic Committee took on a couple of years ago and found to their surprise that 11 of their female athletes actually had Y chromosomes. So getting into that would take a whole lot longer talk, which I'd love to do someday. But anyway, the Adam's apple can be a giveaway. Having said that, I've done 2 operations on cisgendered females who thought their Adam's apples were causing people to think that they were transgender. So there you have it. But this can really be a miracle when a person can have that and they can go from the picture on the left to the picture on the right. The incision always needs to be hidden underneath the jaw, and it riles me when I see it written right in the chest, right in the throat. I'm an OBGYN doing ENT surgery essentially, but Dr. Biber, my predecessor, actually described this surgery for the very first time. Surgery is art, in case you didn't know it, and that's really what it's all about. But you want to put it underneath the jaw, so it should not be visible. Now we're going to get into the deeper subjects of genitalia, which are not commonly discussed, but basically in the male to female version of what we do, testicles are removed. The testicles and part of the erectile tissue are the only things that are discarded. Other than that, we're just rearranging the deck chairs. Now, it'll make sense in a second when you realize that we all start out female. Embryologically, every one of us start with female anatomy. But secondly, the glans penis, of course, becomes the clitoris because that'll be homologous in its sensory innervation and allowing a person to orgasm. The scrotum, we even call them labioscrotal folds embryologically. It makes sense. You take the testicles out and they can become labia. Similarly, the urethra is shortened, and much of the scrotum and the penile skin then becomes the vagina. All of the glands are retained, so a person can even experience arousal and wet fluid. So the real key to understanding why it is that the surgery makes sense is by looking at the embryological development in a condition called hypospadias. This is a naturally occurring biological condition where biological males do not have this fusion process completed, so that the urethra opening actually opens lower along the ventral portion of the scrotum. And in fact, at its most severe form, the genitalia look surprisingly female. Well, that's because we have all started as female. And the process of fusion, in this case, is incomplete. So if we're going to do a reversal surgery and we're going to go from one to the other, that describes kind of what we do in our surgery. So this is what we do. So we go from the picture on the left to the picture on the right, which after delivering babies for 20 years, I can tell you this is just as life-changing. As you can imagine, everything is different. We all know it in society. It is completely different. How the world treats you, how the world interacts with you, and then these are just rapid-fire pictures, which I don't mean to shock you with these. There's also a year marker, and it just shows you the evolution in some of my technical skills. One of the things you'll notice is the very bright, the purple scars. We used to have these incisions quite a bit closer, and what we found now is that if we move them off to the groin, the incisions are almost not even visible. But these are one surgery, one single operation, no touch-ups. This is nice because even the fingernails match. But you can just see how really convincing this can be. And of course, it needs to have this pinkish mucosa. This is the deal breaker. This is what it has to be, and this is where we've really evolved and gotten beyond the competition. We really rock it out, and then this is the 2016 model. Now, the wonderful thing now is that I've been working on this, but really the labia need to surround the vaginal opening, not just end at the urethra. Back earlier, you could have seen that. Anyway, enough pornography, I think you'll agree. Although let's give it, let's be fair and show the boys. So complications include, the most common we see are just wound separations, problem with the incisions. It's a fairly common problem. Necrotic tissue certainly is not uncommon. Granulation tissue, another easily treated primary care problem. fistula, which is really the major complication, actually. And we had, of the rare fistulas we've had, we've actually had one cared for here at Stanford. It was just our worst case in my career, but they can really be devastating. So you really need to have someone who does this well and does it often. And we also know that the quality of the surgery correlates with patients' satisfaction by a couple of studies done here. Then talking about the long-term health of transsexual persons, there are still some questions about suicide and patients still undergoing suicide despite having gone through this process. The naysayers are bring that up as a reason to be dubious of the claims that people are happier afterwards, despite significant evidence to the contrary. But the fact is that it's difficult. There are still huge obstacles for people who are transgender. It's difficult to get a job. They tend to be underemployed. They tend to still lose a lot of their family connections. It's not an easy world for a transgender person. So just because they're able to successfully transition physically and hormonally, it doesn't mean society is going to come along for the ride. So we have to watch these folks, certainly. So there you have it. It's official. I've become my mother. So we might as well talk about penises. You know, why not? It's lunchtime, and we're at Stanford. So of course, if you're going to talk about surgery for the guys, it's got to look functional. It's got to be functional. It's got to get hard, right? It's got to get erect. It's got to look good, and you got to stand to pee. So that's what well, not this guy. He was in Thailand. These are kind of some of the old operations. They were really pretty horrific in some ways, you know, making these, these big, this is a phalloplasty. They've gotten much better. In fact, Curtis Crane does some wonderful work in this city, and he's our newest addition to the community. But this is what we do. We do a kind of a homegrown organic version, a smaller version of creating penises out of female genitalia. This is I guess preoperative state. Did I show that? Yes, I'm not sure what I have on here anymore. Anyway, what we're able to do is use some of that ring flap that we showed, that area, the area of the interlabial mucosa, to create a urethra. And so the clitoris enlarges on testosterone. And so in combination, by creating a urethral tube plus the elongated erectile portions of the clitoris, you can bring that around, sew it together, and it becomes a penis. And so that's exactly what we do. And see, these are some of the examples. I mean, clearly it's not the tallest tree in the forest. I mean, I'll say that, but it's clearly a penis. And you can see here, really pretty convincing. In fact, he's even got another one right over here. But, and then when you put testicles in, now the interesting thing about the testicles is we had, a couple of years ago, we had a supply problem. And it turns out that I said, well, you know, what's going on? I said, you know, where are these testicles coming from? And they said, well, they're coming from Sao Paulo. And I said, wait a minute. I said, do you mean to tell me that we're installing Brazil nuts in our guys? So that's what we do. We put in silicone Brazil nuts, and they look like this. So here's a few more penises. This is pre, and then I guess that was post. No, that was pre, actually. Sorry, I didn't show you the post. And then, of course, demonstrating the ability to pee. A very 2 minutes of female genital mutilation. It's something that you should if you see it, you should know that there's a reversal surgery possible. And it was Dean mentioned it, and I believe that sexual feeling and the ability to have sexual pleasure is one of the basic human rights that we really don't talk about much. And of course, FGM, 130 million women worldwide, but this is where most of the genital mutilations occur, or genital cutting. And this is, of course, at its most severe form. This is a type 3. World Health Organization has 4 classifications, this being the most severe. where the labia are even sewn together. Not only is the clitoris removed, but it's sewn together. The big secret about thing that people don't know is the clitoris is always there. It's actually remained. It's larger than people think it is, and what we do in our surgery is we clear it of scar tissue and we bring it to the surface, and it's always there. We can return sexual feeling to these patients. I'm blessed to have worked with another brilliant person, Pierre Foldis in Paris, to learn the technique. And so what we can do in less than a 1-hour operation is create something like this. And so there's the clitoris, we found it. And then we can even recreate some labia and then show this beautiful pinkish mucosa again. Not only can she have sexual feeling, but she can urinate without obstructing a wall of tissue. She can put a tampon in. And God, how do you have sex with that? So anyway, this is Dr. Biber again at the sink before he finished his career. I'm blessed to have a wonderful practice and an incredible horizon of 2 cultural fronts, if you will. And I'm really honored and thankful that you brought me here to speak.
Thank you very much. Should we do some questions?
Yeah,
Is that
let's
okay?
do that, sure.
Please have a seat. Mitch, thanks. Well, we'd like to open it up now for questions, and I think we have some microphones, 2 microphones here. Please come forward. We welcome your questions.
I can speak from here. The last picture you just showed,
Yes.
the mutilation,
Yes.
she was quite close. I'm just curious what happens to her menstrual period.
Well, that's exactly a problem. With this is before surgery, correct? Yes, so often menstruation is blocked. In fact, there's a condition called hematocolpos where the uterus fills up with blood because of years of obstructed menstruation. And of course, it also obstructs childbirth. So many of the obstetrical fistulas that you hear, our wonderful country sends volunteers to come help repair these things throughout Africa. Those are caused because the sewing is so tight that the baby can't fit through, and it literally hemorrhages out through the bladder or through the rectum. So it's a tremendous problem. I really do believe it can end, though, in my lifetime. Thank you.
Other questions?
Oh, please, they'll come out. I mean, as we get fluid, we gotta all get comfortable here, so.
More comfortable. In the transgender population that you spoke of, I guess is that period of psychological, evaluation, getting them ready. How intensive you want that process to be? How critical of you or the, psychiatrists they choose, who they talk, what they talk about, the whole process. Can you expand on that a little bit? And you said that very few people are sorry after they've gone through the completion of the process.
Yeah, well, I think everybody should have psychotherapy. I think it's actually very, 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 instructive. It's cathartic, if nothing else. I mean, who hasn't been traumatized by their brother, taking their blue truck for, 5 years? Things like that. So, just a lot of things come out when you do psychotherapy. It does give the wrong message, and I think to the medical community, we've been blinded by the fact that we send them to psychiatrists or psychologists, and thinking that it's something, because that's what the people who argue against it would like you to believe, is that it's a psychological condition, and that somehow it can be repaired through counseling or redirecting, handing them a doll, to make them be feminine, or handing them a football to make them be masculine. So it's not psychological, but we could all use the psychological support. And I can tell you, changing sex is really demanding on your psyche and on those around you. So you need that support. If people pull away, you need to have an advocate that goes along with you through the process. So that's why we recommend the psychological support.
That's what for the support.
Exactly.
Because the family needs the support too.
Everyone needs support. Absolutely. It's difficult. It's a very difficult thing to inflict on your family. And transgender persons don't always understand the impact that it has on everyone around you. Your children. Actually, children, ironically, are the least affected usually by it. They're much more fluid than the rest of us are.
And some of the things that we've actually seen in the PRIDE study since we launched in June, the kind of engagement that we've seen from the trans community has actually been to provide support for each other throughout this, and that in many parts of the country where being transgender may be a little less accepted than San Francisco, that the need for transgender support groups, whether it's made up of transgender people or other people providing that support in the various phases of transition, whether it's a social transition, whether it's medical transition with hormones alone, or whether it's surgical transition with Dr. Bowers, there's need for support at each one of those steps, and those steps are different, and then supports that are needed are different, and so that's a continual need that this community is facing. And so I think that being a component of the WPATH standards is just so that, to really ensure that that support is with that person before they embark on this, very important journey.
Yes.
So one of these little things that we can change happened here at Stanford. I had a friend who went through transgender female-to-male surgery, and if anybody can imagine that stage at which you have facial hair, but you don't want to make that walk into the men's room, with the urinals and it's what do you do? And there aren't really that many places where you can go, and there was a simple request to change, to make private dual gender bathrooms in a building, and it created a furor.
Well,
because there was a history of there weren't as many of this gender or that gender, and it was just a little thing, but it was very, very hard, for my friend, and I was just wondering, how do you speak of those things? How do you not make the person do all the fighting for him or herself?
Well, I speak about this. This is another one of my favorite little quotes, but the notion of gender identity is one of the most ridiculous things that humans have inflicted on one another. Because if you think about biology and any other biological measure, where else are we only given two choices? It really makes no sense. And somebody also said to me once that, assigning gender identity on the basis of genitalia makes about as much sense as assigning it on the basis of height. So imagine if you only had tall people and short people, and you made all the tall people men and the short people women. It's almost that arbitrary.
Yeah, I would say the same thing, and I think society is gradually changing and understanding that there are more than two gender identities, right? Facebook allows you to select between 52 different genders on Facebook, right? Very different terms, and one would say that they, lots of them can collapse down to smaller groups. But I think that the concept of gender identity as being binary is slowly evolving, and it is happening largely by champions in local places. And that's whether that's a non-gendered bathrooms at an academic institution. The San Diego airport has bathrooms that are just labeled all gender bathroom.
Wow.
And I actually had to, it struck me walking through the airport that was, of all places, that was a place that had one. And was, very prominently displayed. It wasn't around the corner down a hallway behind the food court or something like that. So I think that it really takes an institutional commitment, and I think as more and more institutions change it broadly, that allows society to advance. And those institutions are not just academic institutions, but businesses and really everywhere, right? But it really takes a champion, unfortunately, probably within many of those institutions, and as more and more institutions start to make change, then it takes the burden off of the individual to be the fighter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes.
My question is for Dean Minor, and I suppose the other panelists as well, but what is Stanford School of Medicine doing to understand and address these challenges, and if the other panelists can weigh in on how their institutions are doing as well. So what is Stanford Medicine doing to address these challenges, and how can we get involved?
Well, I think Mitch talked about, in his remarks, talked about the work that he pioneered here as a medical student that continues to move forward with others since he's moved on to his residency fellowship and now a faculty member at UCSF. But Mitch, do you want to talk about some of the things that you continue to...
I think that you can always get involved with the medical education research group here. It kind of ebbs and flows depending on which medical students are leading it at that given time. And then there's now through education redesign here, there's now committees and work groups that are starting to look at sexuality and how that fits into the curriculum. And then I would encourage you to find a cause, not necessarily one that already exists, but also one that you're really passionate about. This is a place that allowed me and my colleagues to do stuff that we were passionate about without, we didn't have to kind of piggyback onto some existing policy or program. We kind of were able to create it on our own, and were met with, with support from both faculty, the administration, and others in this community. And so I think, being a medical student here was met with great flexibility. I think, taking a year off to work in Dr. Kierkegaard's lab, to do other things, was part of my career. Here, and if I really wouldn't be as dedicated to sexual and gender minority health were it not for for the support that I received while I was here. So I would rather, I think there's many places to get involved, but I would also encourage you to find causes that you're really passionate about and fight for them.
I think we have two people at the mics, and I think we'll probably need to end it there because I know some people have some other commitments, but please, go ahead.
When you look at the academic medical organizations throughout North America, some of which you may be already working with to capture data, what do you see as some of the biggest obstacles or barriers to capturing the good data? Human resources organizations, for example, and do you have any stories or suggestions on how to overcome some of those examples?
Sure, yeah. So I think the question is capturing data just about who the employees are, for example, whether they're gathering their sexual orientation and gender identity. That occurs in some institutions and doesn't occur in most. I think the other issue is patient data, right, and whether or not we collect sexual orientation and gender identity in the medical record in the hospital, and that the person's preferred name is there, and what pronouns they use appears in the banner on the top of the Apex, or sorry, that's a UCSF-centric term, the EPIC medical record, or whichever. And so, UC Davis is actually probably one of the pioneers of collecting that information in healthcare settings, in that there are specific fields in EPIC for gender identity and for sexual orientation, and the banners and pronouns and everything get automatically updated so that when somebody presents to check in at the front desk, they aren't, misgendered and given the wrong name. And so, but the vast majority of places, it is done by a provider or small group only basis. When I was a resident and had a primary care practice, I had my own section at the top of every note so that I could just go to my last note and make sure that I was using the right names, pronouns, and gender with a patient when they would come in. But that was a system that I had to create on my own. But stage 3 of meaningful use, if meaningful use continues to exist, which for those of you that aren't familiar with it, is that electronic medical records are used in a meaningful way and that it collects meaningful data. So stage 3 was supposed to happen sometime in 2017 or 18 or so, and it was actually part of the stage 3 rule that sexual orientation and gender identity would be collected in the electronic medical record. We don't necessarily know if meaningful use is actually going to continue based on some recent comments from Medicare, but I think that largely it remains uncollected.
Last question, please.
Thank you. I wanted to appreciate both of you for your contributions. I know they're immense. Dr. Bowers, it's an honor to be in your presence. I've been taking care of transgender people since the mid-1990s, and thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to just also reflect that I think that the changes are happening very quickly as the generation upcoming demands honesty in gender and sexuality, but every kind of identity. And so I'm starting to see it in many ways, universities happening by generation. I see much more acceptance in my younger students than in my peers. And I anticipate that those changes will happen as well. For people that were looking to contribute, the medical school is looking at overhauling its curriculum. And if you're interested in being in the work group on sexuality, sexual function, and gender identity, talk to me. And there's other members from my committee that are here, and we're really interested in hearing what you think about the curriculum and what should come and what you've heard elsewhere. So I just wanted to thank you for that, and also for the PRIDE. The PRIDE study is excellent. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Marci and Mitch, thank you so much for being with us today, and thank all of you for coming here and participating in this discussion of an incredibly important topic. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.